Hello everyone. For those of you who are new here, welcome. This is a podcast all about sharks, rays and their underwater habitat, brought to you by the Save Our Seas Foundation. And every episode, I sit down with a panel of experts in marine science and conservation, and we take a deep dive into one of your questions. And for our regular listeners, welcome back. Thank you so much for all the lovely feedback and comments on season 1. We've loved hearing from you, and thanks as well for all of your questions. We will be answering some of them on this season, so stay tuned. Now, on to today's episode. We are kind of continuing a thread from our last episode of The Whole Tooth, where we spoke to the brilliant Jodie Rummer and Carolyn Wheeler on the physiological impacts of climate change on sharks. Now, today's episode is looking at a slightly different aspect as we ask our experts, can sharks adapt to changing seas? And focus on shark behaviour and movement ecology. Of course, when we say changing seas, this doesn't just mean in environmental terms, but with respect to expanding human activity as well. So we'll be talking about not just the effects of things like ocean warming and decreasing oxygen levels on shark space use, but also the effect of human activity and how these can overlap to produce compounding effects. Our two experts today, who will be guiding us on this fascinating deep dive, are shark scientists Professor David Sims and PhD candidate Freya Womersley, who are part of the Global Shark Movement Project, or GSMP for short. As the name suggests, this is a collection of over 150 scientists from around the world who are sharing and analysing data on how sharks move about and use our oceans. David leads the GSMP and is also a senior research fellow at the Marine Biological Association and professor of marine ecology at the University of Southampton in the UK. His research focuses on the movement ecology and conservation of marine predators, and he has studied a number of different species of shark, including the second largest, the basking shark, and more recently, the blue shark. He has authored more than 180 papers and is best known for his biologging studies of shark behaviour. Freya is a researcher at the MBA as well, and is approaching the final year of her PhD, which uses data from the GSMP to answer a number of very topical and important questions, including the present-day distribution of pelagic sharks, how to quantify human threats, and how future environmental niches of sharks may look in response to climate change. She has also spent a lot of time in the field with whale sharks, and for her master's thesis studied interactions between them and tourism. While she was doing this, she discovered some super interesting findings about how whale sharks recover from injury, which she talks about in this episode. I could have talked to David and Freya for hours. They are so incredibly knowledgeable and their work is so timely and innovative, but unfortunately we only had 60 minutes. So without further ado, let's dive into our episode. Can sharks adapt to changing seas? With David Sims and Freya Womersley. David and Freya, hello and welcome to the podcast.
Hi,
Hello.
thanks for having us.
It's so I'm so looking forward to talking to you actually, because I often get this feeling with the podcast where I've read so much about people and I've cited them in my own work, and so I almost feel like I know the people, which is very weird. I'm sure a lot of people who are on social media feel this way as well, so it's so nice to actually meet you both. I would say in person, but you know, obviously on Zoom. But yes, we are going to talk today all about the work that you guys do, understanding how sharks use and move around our oceans and how that is going to be affected by things like climate change, by fishing pressures, and what this might mean for sharks. But before we get into that, I always like to kick off the podcast with a couple of questions just to get to know you both. And our first one is, what is your most memorable experience in the ocean? So, David, I will come to you first. Sorry.
Yeah, I've been asked this a few times, actually, and it never gets easier to answer, actually, what's the most memorable. But I suppose if we're going to think about memory, I've got to think right back because if I can remember something now that happened a very long time ago, then clearly it was memorable. So I'm going to go for something that happened 32 years ago. Everyone's thinking, oh gosh, I wasn't born then. But yeah, 32 years ago, I was lucky enough to be diving and was in the same plankton patch as two basking sharks. And I watched them for a long time, feeding up and down, sort of mowing the lawn. And yeah, so for 32 years, that is in my head, and I can see it now as if it were yesterday. So yeah, definitely my memorable experience among many.
Incredible. I was so hoping that you would say a basking shark one.
Yeah, it was incredible. I mean, just to be in the presence of something so huge, going about its business. We were really lucky to intercept it on its incredible journey. I still feel privileged about that.
Oh, amazing. And Freya, how about you? What was your most memorable experience in the ocean?
I think that the most memorable one for me was when I was working in the Maldives in the northern atolls. After my contract ended, we travelled to the deep south to an island called Formula, and it's just north of the southernmost atoll in the Maldives called Adu Atoll, and it's a sort of a big oceanic pinnacle-like island that descends really deep on the coast, and there are really strong seasonal currents, and you get loads of really big pelagic megafauna passing through, and it's amazing. And one dive we travelled to the south of the island, and we descended to around 50 metres, and the viz was really, really good. So you could sort of see the bottom around 60, 75 metres, and it was just sort of a sandy bottom at the time. And then you'd suddenly start to see these kind of shadows emerging out of the bottom. And they were these huge sort of 2-metre tiger sharks. And there are around 6 or 7 of them, these kind of majestic, sort of docile, slow moving shadows. And then they started to ascend a bit to come and sort of check us out. And there was one particular 2-metre plus female that kind of started to swim towards me. And I'm trying to take a really good camera shot, be all calm and relaxed and still. And you can kind of see the moment in the camera where I just sort of lose my cool. And she kind of gets quite close and the camera's like this, and just out of pure excitement. And I think, just being in that moment when you see that animal for the first time, it's just such awe and adrenaline and reverence and all of that kind of mixed into one. It was such an amazing moment. And we started to descend after we'd seen all those tigers, and we got to about 40 metres, and we came across a school of hammerheads, scalloped hammerheads, and we kind of penetrated the edge of the school, so it kind of broke up and they started to surround us, and it was just like being in this soup of hammerheads mingled in with these tigers that were slightly below. And I can picture it, like David says, I can picture it now. And I think for me, during lockdowns and desk-based work, it's these kind of really strong memories of just being in the presence of these animals that's kept me going. And it was such an amazing dive, and I remember it so well. So I recommend anyone keen on sharks or diving, you should definitely check out that location. It was amazing.
Sorry, what was it called again? I love the name of that.
I always pronounce it incorrectly, but I think I say formula, but it's pronounced, or it's spelt like Fuvahmulah, Fuvahmulah. So it's a local name. Fuvahmulah, yeah.
It rolls off the tongue really well, but yeah.
I'm probably saying it wrong.
I hold my hands up and say I wouldn't know how to say that, but yeah, what an incredible dive. Just like layers upon layers of sharks, just insane.
It was epic, yeah, really, really special.
I just wondered if we could talk a little bit about the Global Shark Movement project itself, which you are both involved in. So David, can you explain to us what the project is and how it came to be?
Yeah, sure. So the Global Shark Movement project, globalsharkmovement.org. There's a website that you can look at, and it shows some of the work that we're doing and what the aims are. But just to give you an idea, it's a movement about movement. And so our aim, sort of 5 years ago when we started this, myself and my close collaborator, Nuno Queiroz, who's at the University of Porto, when we brought this into being, when we initiated it, had this idea, was to bring together research groups who had collected satellite tracking and sort of data logging, dive data, temperature data from all sorts of different pelagic sharks. The reason that we wanted to do it was because up to that point, there had been studies in sort of discrete areas in different oceans, but there hadn't really been a global sort of view. We had this idea to bring together all these researchers to share data, and from that to undertake global analyses, which would help us to understand the space use of sharks in relation to environmental changes. So, were there particular drivers of environmental variables that were driving particular behaviors, space use patterns, but migratory routes, and maybe shifts in distribution as well, according to changing seasonality of the oceans. And also, perhaps most importantly, in relation to anthropogenic threats. And so if you visit the website, you'll see we have a whole range of projects going from the overlap, a global overlap of sharks with longline fisheries to, as you'll hear about from Freya, sort of whale sharks in relation to shipping. But we've also got projects on the way in which sharks use oxygen minimum zones. And hopefully I can chat a bit more about that in the podcast. But so that's what the Global Shark Movement is about. It brings together about 40 research groups across 26 countries. So there's about 150 to 200 scientists involved, all with the same sort of vision to share and to work together to enable us to undertake these broader scale analyses, to try and put in context some of the problems and some of the interesting ecology that these sharks are involved in. I mean, when I started, I was chatting earlier, about sort of 30 years ago when I started on sharks, back in 1856. But, 30 years ago, no one really, there were 3 of us doing PhDs on sharks, on elasmobranchs in the whole of the UK. Just 3 of us, myself, Nick Dolvey, and Jim Ellis. And we were the only 3, to my knowledge. We used to sort of meet up at little conferences here and there. But now there's so many more people interested because there has to be this interest because of the problems that are posed. And I'm sure we can go into those, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're completely right. There's so much of an appetite for it, but not just within the scientific community, but also, from the general public as well, who are becoming more aware of the threats that sharks face and also changing their perceptions of sharks as well and wanting to protect them a little bit more. And so, when we get asked questions for this podcast, an overwhelming number of questions are about climate change or about fishing pressures and how shark distribution overlaps them. There seems to be a real worry about it. But yes, in the show notes, we'll link to that website. It's really easy to use. It's got some lovely infographics on it and you can see all the projects really clearly. And of course, Freya, you work with some of the data from the Global Shark Movement Project for your PhD. So I wondered if you could tell the listeners what it is exactly that you are looking at. So what questions are you trying to answer?
So I'm one of the lucky ones that gets to utilise all of the amazing data that we've compiled as part of the Global Shark Movement Project. And I just have to say first off that it's truly amazing to be part of such a monumental collaboration. And it is where I sort of always hoped that I would end up. So for my PhD, I'm developing methods to analyse the tracking data that we have within the GSMP to answer some of these important and topical questions in shark ecology and also conservation. And at the moment, arguably, 2 of the most important questions related to that are what threats are sharks exposed to and where, and also, how might they respond to climate change, so our future oceans. And these are actually big questions, so they require big data sets and collaboration, which is what we can facilitate here at the GSMP. So to build on my previous research experience and my interests, we developed my first chapter, which is in the final stages of completion now, we think. And that's looking at the threat of vessel collision posed to the whale shark from the shipping industry. So whale sharks spend a lot of time feeding in shallow surface waters, and they can aggregate in close coastal regions which are close to ports as well. And there's often a huge amount of this large vessel traffic in these areas. So that's these huge cargo ships, tankers as well, transporting goods, fuel, all these sorts of things across the world. And in areas where they overlap, the sharks can be struck by some of these colossal ships. And this species is endangered, and they're experiencing population declines. And in a lot of regions, it's actually unclear why their populations are declining. So we don't really know why so many individuals are being lost from these populations. And so that's what this chapter is aiming to do. We sort of want to demystify this issue. We want to try and identify whether shipping might be causing some mortality and leading to some of these population declines. And we want to bring this to the attention of not just the sort of conservation managers, but also the general public. We want everyone to know that this could be a real impact of our activities of shipping that perhaps is less understood at the moment. And that's what a paper like this can do. And then moving on from that, my next chapter aims to model the global distributions of whale sharks, and in doing this we can generate habitat suitability maps, and this involves analysing the tracking data that we have alongside a suite of sort of remotely sensed environmental conditions like temperature, oxygen, chlorophyll A, that sort of thing. And this can help us identify the species' preferences for their environments, which means we can then extrapolate these preferences or apply these preferences to regions that we didn't have tracking data, which allows us to have a kind of a broader understanding of which habitats are suitable, where these sharks may be spending time. And these maps are really important because they can help us identify important habitats, conservation areas. They can be used to improve on some of these threat quantification studies. So perhaps instead of tracking data, we can base our threat quantification on suitability or global distribution. And of course, really importantly, they provide us with a baseline for present day distribution, which we can then compare against future climates, so our changing oceans in response to climate change. And that's where my last few chapters will focus. I'll be looking at how are these present day distributions going to be shifting in the years 2050, 2100 in response to climate change that's been promoted through human activities.
Oh, it sounds so fascinating, and I'm really excited to see what comes out of your PhD and excited to read the papers when they do come out. But yes, I can see why it's your dream PhD. It sounds incredible. But we've kind of been talking about it a little bit already. But you know, sharks notoriously are not easy animals to study. They don't tend to stay in one place, and you know, they live in a huge, vast place like the ocean. So what technologies can we use to sort of understand where they move? So we've kind of mentioned tags. So for somebody who doesn't know much about that process, can you explain how we even go about this?
Okay, I'll start off and then I'm sure Freya can come in. But when you study pelagic sharks, as we do, which, as you mentioned, can swan off, you know, you attach a tag and then they disappear, you know, travel for 1,000 kilometers, you know, you're necessarily never going to see them again. So you have to have technology which can operate over these huge distances and over long time periods as well. But I guess in my sort of career, the device that I think has had an incredible impact is the so-called pop-off satellite archival transmitter. And this is something that sort of, it looks like a karaoke microphone, and it's got an antenna on it. And the idea is that you attach it to a shark, much like a sort of parasite, you know, a lamprey or something clamps onto a basking shark. You attach it and it goes beneath the shark goes beneath the surface, and the tag is recording essentially three things: the pressure, which obviously gives depth, the water temperature, and light. And the light level is really important to measure, because from light level can be calculated the longitude and the latitude of where the tag is. Then at a pre-programmed time, that little device I mentioned, the karaoke microphone, would pop off, float to the surface, and then relay its data via the Argos polar orbiting satellites. Encoded in that data would be these light level data, the depth data, and the temperature data. And a really amazing scientist, Barbara Block, then working at Stanford University, was really the first to sort of test this pop-off satellite device and to use light level geolocation to reconstruct the tracks of bluefin tuna in the Atlantic, actually. Mm-hmm. And we were around at the time when these tags were just coming out, and we were lucky to get them pretty much within sort of a few months of them being commercially available. And we were able to put them very quickly onto basking sharks. And so that's why we ended up being sort of, I guess, at least one of the first groups to use this light level geolocation method to reconstruct the tracks of basking sharks over months and months of the year.
Yeah, but oh my God, fascinating. I've just got so many images in my head now of when you said karaoke microphone. My initial thought is lots of sharks with that kind of like Britney mic on the side of their face. I know that's not what they look like, but that's what comes to mind.
Well, they used to email us, essentially. The shark, it got reported in the press that we used to get emails from sharks. And it's sort of true, because the tag would pop off.
Yeah.
Probably quite close, obviously close to the shark if it was still around in a patch or something, a basking shark. The tag would come to the surface and relay the data to a satellite receiving station in Toulouse, in France, of all places. And then that would relay back to the MBA lab and essentially via an email. So I would get an email from Shark, 30467, Bertha, of course, or some such name. And it would say, I'm off Scotland, essentially. And I've been diving to 400 meters or whatever. And so, you do get these sort of amazing sort of things happen as a consequence of this technology, that you're interacting more with the shark than you thought you would at the start.
Amazing. I mean, not many people can say they've been emailed by a basking shark, that's for sure. And you can see it on Twitter now. They've got a couple of different organizations have got Twitter pages for the sharks that they tag, and it's almost like it's the shark giving the updates of where they are. It's amazing. It's like a little insight into a secret world that kind of we wouldn't ordinarily be part of. And it's incredible to see where these animals go.
It's really the miniaturization of these different sensors that's allowed us to kind of progress things. So we're now able to get some sort of some of these recorders really quite small and added into different types of tagging technologies. So, for example, oxygen sensors, which we've now been developing in our lab with a new tag called the Trident. And I think there's some information about that online, isn't there, David, with our lab and on the Global Shark Movement Project. And it's just being able to get these batteries much smaller, being able to get these sensors much smaller and fit them into tags that allows us to monitor not just their movements, but also the environments that they're experiencing, both at the surface when it's relaying to satellite, but also at depth as well, if we're able to retrieve the tag. So it's really sort of expanding what we're capable of recording through being able to get more fitted onto the shark, because of course you don't want them lugging around this enormous tag that's got a video recorder on it, it's got these sensors, this sensor. So it's all about getting that as small as you can, so it's not influencing the shark's movement or life too much, but then it's able to record and relay that with a sufficient battery back to satellite. And that's all going on at the moment, and it is amazing some of the developments that we're seeing.
And that brings us on really, really nicely to some of the findings and the outputs of your research as well. So one of the things that I was really interested to talk about is probably one of the most prominent results to have come out of the project, and David, your work as well, which talks about the oxygen minimum zones, which you mentioned earlier. And I just wondered if you could explain, first of all, what these oxygen minimum zones are and why they're important, and then also what you've found about, sharks and their behavior around these areas.
Sure, yeah. Just to start with some context, obviously the point to remember is that the ocean is losing oxygen. This is something that's been happening. It's been recorded empirically for the last sort of half century. And models suggest that this isn't going to stop anytime soon. They suggest that this will keep happening at least for the next 1,000 years. The fact that the ocean is losing oxygen is going to be an enduring problem. And these oxygen minimum zones in particular are important because they seem to be areas of particularly rapid change, rapid loss in oxygen. But for our part, working on pelagic sharks, we became interested in them because blue sharks and short-fin mako sharks that we've been satellite tracking in the Atlantic. An incredible researcher that we work with, Gonzalo Musientes, at the Institute of Oceanography in Vigo in Spain, did a lot of our tagging of short-fin makers and blues across the central part of the Atlantic when he was invited onto commercial longliners. And that enabled us to tag larger individuals that were also migrating to some of these more sort of, to these open ocean structures, which if you were just tagging on the shelf, they might not go there in the time limit of your tag life, for example. And Gonzalo was able to tag, and what we found was that blue sharks and mako sharks, seasonally, some of the individuals headed south. And so from the Central Atlantic around the Azores, for example, at a certain time of year, they headed south and they interacted, they came across an area off the west coast of Africa, which is the Eastern Tropical Atlantic oxygen minimum zone. And this has decreasing oxygen from about 200 meters to about 800 meters. So if you can envisage, it's sort of like a blob, a bubble of water that has increasing levels of hypoxia as you go more or less towards the center, towards the core. And the blue sharks were migrating there and spending time in what looked to us above the water of the oxygen minimum zone, in that surface layer. And so we're really interested to know more. Why is it that they were going there, and what were they doing? And what we found is that as they came into these oxygen minimum zones, their maximum daily dive depth decreased. So it got shallower. And initially we thought, well, that's a clear response to oxygen. I mean, normally in the Atlantic, right out where Gonzalo had tracked them, we'd recorded them diving down to 1,700 meters, both species. Wow. Going down into the bathy pelagic, where it's completely dark. And Gonzalo had also noticed that the stomach contents of ones which were caught commercially were full of these hypoxia-tolerant cephalopods. And so they were obviously diving down into these open ocean areas to feed on cephalopods. Now, in the oxygen minimum zones, blue sharks seem to be able to dive deep. So outside, the maximum daily dive depth adjacent to the oxygen minimum zone would be about 1,200 meters. But within overlaying the area of the oxygen minimum zone, where we were tracking them using the Argos tags, the dive data showed that decreased by about 40%. So actually they got shallower, their dives got shallower by about 40%. So the maximum dive they did was about 750 meters. And what we found was that it was a complex of factors that were driving this. It wasn't just the oxygen, that was a main factor. And it looks like the blue shark can withstand mild hypoxia. You can imagine a blue shark holding its breath and saying, right, I'm going for it. I know that there are some hypoxia intolerant cephalopods down there. I'm going for it. And they make these dives, but they can't probably stay in that hypoxia for long. And that's indeed what we found, is that as the oxygen starts to get lower, the dissolved oxygen concentration gets lower, so the sharks, there is a boundary, a behavioral sort of response boundary, a threshold below which they won't really go. Also important was temperature of the water as well. So in these oxygen minimum zones, there's really warm water. There's very strong stratification, which obviously causes this sort of these steep gradients. And in fact, the sharks would also avoid the warm water. So here we have a situation of a shark being caught in the middle. It's got low oxygen below it and warm water above it. And that's where the interaction with fisheries became most interesting.
You did mention adding fishing into the equation. So like I said at the very beginning, we're not just seeing oceans change in the way of there's going to be environmental changes, we're also seeing it change in how they're being used. So one of those elements is fishing pressure. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that. So how did those two things overlap in the case of the blue and the short-fin mako sharks?
The blue shark, they were undergoing habitat compression. So their habitat was being compressed into that sort of top layer. But when the water was too warm, obviously they would go a bit deeper. So they were sort of sandwiched into quite a restricted vertical niche. And of course, one thing we noticed Nuno Queiroz, who I mentioned earlier, his group had done fantastic work getting hold of the movements of fishing vessels using the vessel monitoring system, GPS data. And so Nuno and his colleagues very cleverly managed to get the movements of the Spanish and Portuguese longlining fleet. And what we found very quickly was that there were hotspots of fishing activity. And over the oxygen minimum zone was a fishing hotspot. And so we were really interested to explore that. Why were the fishers being drawn there? Most of the year. I mean, they were tracking the shark resources in that location pretty much all year round. When we looked a bit further, we could see that where the sharks were hanging out, which especially on the northern boundary of that oxygen minimum zone, so just off the coast of Morocco, Mauritania, near the Cape Verde Islands, there's a really steep northern part, a northern gradient of oxygen. And the sharks, the blue sharks, it looked like that was a boundary, a threshold, and that perhaps was aggregating them, because over top that area, the surface longliners were spending most of their time. It wasn't just that the effort was increased. So this is a long line, each vessel has, and there could be 20, 30 longliners working a particular area. They each deploy every day a long line that's about 100 kilometers long with about 1,200 baited hooks set at a particular depth. Mm-hmm. And you can see where I'm going with this. If you've got a restricted vertical niche of the sharks, they're more likely to be found in a particular band of water. Mm-hmm. And it appears that the longline fishers, through their experience and their efficiency in this fishery, have learned that. And so in this region, they deploy hooks within that compressed range. We then, Gonzalo and Nuno, who I mentioned, were able to get hold of the logbook data from the Spanish government as well, which was very interesting because that showed us where the blue sharks and the mako sharks were actually being caught. Mm-hmm. And the blue sharks were being caught where the fishing vessels were spending most time. The catches were much, much higher. They were up to 12 times higher on the northern boundary of that oxygen minimum zone compared to adjacent areas. So that complex of climate change, ocean deoxygenation, surface warming, interacting with longline fishing, setting at a particular depth, was enabling fishers to improve their catches, to increase their catches in that particular region versus one that was probably just only 50 kilometers, 100 kilometers further north. Yeah. So here it presents us with a question as researchers and as people, as society. How will climate change affect the fishery catches in the future? Will they enhance, will they exacerbate those population declines we're already seeing of oceanic sharks?
Yeah, I mean, so effectively what you're ending up with there is effectively like a shark trap. So lots of different things are acting all at once to sort of almost trap these sharks in one small area, and then the fisheries kind of come over and overlap with that, which is, I imagine, quite worrying because we've talked about this on a previous episode of the podcast, but overfishing and overexploitation is probably the biggest threat facing sharks worldwide. So if they can, if climate change is going to make that worse, or, deoxygenation and all these other different factors, that is extremely worrying. And I mean, Freya, I'm going to unfortunately ask you to sort of look into the future here.
I'll get out my crystal ball.
Yeah. But I mean, and also in terms of like looking forward to the last couple of chapters of your PhD as well, which you've not written yet, but what might we expect to see? What kind of changes might we expect to see in terms of shark environmental niches and shark behavior, as climate change advances? Will we be seeing more of the same as what David's found, or, will we be seeing slightly different things?
Yeah. Well, it's the ultimate question, really, isn't it? And I think it's a question that we're still answering, and we still will be answering long into the future, because as methods improve and as we start to get, more real-time observations, we'll start to develop our ideas about it. But first off, I think it's important to sort of divide sharks really by either species or groups, because they will have these species or group specific responses to climate change. And in our lab, we work primarily on pelagic sharks, and it makes it a little bit easier to discuss what we expect to happen if we consider just the pelagic shark group, for example. So adult pelagic sharks, they're wide-ranging. They make long distance movements. And so we can sort of begin to theorize that they have a fair amount of freedom to select or move throughout environments that meet their physiological requirements, which means that if an environment becomes unfavorable, so for example, low DO levels, low oxygen levels, it might be too hot or too cold, we can assume that they can simply move away from that environment. And similarly, they can move towards environments that they may perhaps prefer. So in terms of their movements and their horizontal distributions, we might expect them then to be able to adapt their ranges to remain within those environmental conditions that they're best suited. And indeed, because we expect these environmental conditions to shift in future, as a result, we're going to be seeing some shifts in these geographical distributions in response to this. And it will, as David has touched on, sort of depend on the complex relationships between different variables. But temperature as a starting point is a really good example to bring out here, because we are getting a better understanding of how warming seas might start to impact shark and ray species year on year. So temperature in future, we're going to have sort of warmer equatorial seas, we're going to have expanding poleward isotherms, and we expect to see this mirrored in species ranges, and we are already seeing it sort of start to play out across the globe already. And there are a few sort of key examples that we can pull out from that. So, for example, on the east coast of the US, we've got lots of sightings or unprecedented sightings of juvenile white sharks that are now occurring in the sort of northern area of Monterey Bay in California. And this is said to sort of signal a significant shift in their young white shark range. And that northward range shift is likely due to the fact that the juvenile sharks are having to search for more suitable thermal habitats, and it means that the water temperatures within their preferred temperature range are becoming a little bit more difficult to find. So we're seeing this latitudinal range shift for this species. And in one particular study, they found that the cold limit, the geographical limit that they were experiencing from about the 1980s to 2013, where the warming was a little bit more stable, was around 34 degrees north on average. And then we had, of course, this marine heat wave in 2014 to 16, and this range jumped to 38.5 degrees north. So it's this big latitudinal shift of this particular juvenile stage of this pelagic shark. And this gives us a little bit of, an example of what we might start to see with some more sort of prolonged and chronic warming temperatures across the ocean. And we've also seen similar shifts in whale sharks as an example. So in the Atlantic, the Azores, we're starting to see more and more sightings of whale sharks around the Azores, and that's been linked to this sort of northern shifting 22 degrees centigrade isotherm. And that's the kind of thing that I'm hoping to look at in the last few chapters of my PhD. So are we going to be seeing these shifting latitudinal ranges? What does this mean for equatorial ranges? Are we going to see habitat losses, particularly for whale sharks, which aggregate in some of these areas? Is it going to become too hot for them to aggregate? What's that going to mean for that life stage of those juvenile males that have to sort of group together in these coastal nurseries and things like that? And this is happening across the board, really. I mean, thresher sharks in the Pacific, and then the Atlantic as well. And of course, as David mentioned, species may also alter their vertical depth use. So it's quite complex for us to understand because, of course, they exist within these three-dimensional environments. So we might see these range shifts, latitudinal shifts, but we also may just see that some species alter their depth distribution in response to warmer, shallow coastal waters, that sort of thing. And this can have quite a lot of knock-on implications for things like tourism. If you require a shark to be sighted at the surface, for example, and it's going deeper, what does that mean for that industry? And as David mentioned, exposure to different fishing apparatus at different depths. And there are lots of other variables as well. Dissolved oxygen, as David mentioned, these kind of things all acting, simultaneously together to try and we have to try and understand what that will mean for some of these distributions.
Definitely. So many question marks. And for any future scientists, marine scientists listening, these are the areas that, we really, really need people to be working on and going into the future. Quite an interesting point too is this idea that something that I get asked a lot is, in terms of climate change, can sharks just not move somewhere else, but that's not factoring in sharks that are already kind of at the extremes of their ranges. And we had a really interesting episode with Jodie Rummer and Carolyn Wheeler as well, who work on epaulet sharks, who are kind of on coral reefs in Australia. And they were saying these little sharks are basically like can exist like at the extremes already. And they're finding it hard when they're trying to, simulate those experiments in the lab as well. So really, really interesting stuff. But in terms of, we've talked about it already, but I just want to pick up on some kind of specific things that both of you have found in terms of how sharks might adapt. So David, just to sort of pull out what you were saying earlier about the fact that blue sharks might have a slight advantage in being able to exploit hypoxia tolerant prey and potentially cope with larger areas of low oxygen. Can you explain maybe a little bit more about that? Does that mean that they could potentially adapt to future conditions?
Yeah, I'd echo what Freya says there, in as much that, these pelagic sharks are incredibly good at having already adapted to a whole range of conditions. And they're clearly able to occupy various habitats. We found with the blue shark, not only does it spend time at the surface where it can feed on pelagic, silvery shoaling fishes, which of course will also be, if they're hypoxia intolerant, will also be undergoing habitat compression. And we find actually that it's not just blue sharks and shortfin makos, but also oceanic whitetips, silky sharks. They're all above this oxygen minimum zone. And that could be because of the foraging opportunities of habitat compression of hypoxia intolerant species. But for the blue shark, I think it looks like it does have an advantage in being able to dive into, at least for short periods, into mild hypoxia. Because the shortfin mako, some of our results that we haven't published yet, so this is stop press, don't tell anyone about this, will you? It's just between us, is that the shortfin mako can't do it or doesn't choose to do it. All of the makos we've tracked in that eastern tropical Atlantic oxygen minimum zone stays within the top 200 meters. It never dives deeper than that. And that could be an advantage for it as well. It can take advantage of those schooling fishes, those silvery fishes that are under habitat compression. But for the blue shark that has to compete with these other predators like the shortfin mako, there could be an advantage to diving deeper, even if there's a cost attached to that. So yeah, it's complicated. They are widely ranging, but there are limits, and Freya touched on that very, in a brilliant answer, I should say, Freya, that they are able to shift, but there will be an upper limit on that. So very complex, lots to do, and I would encourage researchers interested in sharks. This is a burgeoning area. We're just touching on it now. The technology is becoming available. It's a great time to get into it. And I'd encourage or anyone who's interested to jump full length into this.
That's a great advertisement. But yeah, for sure, any future shark scientists listening to this, take that as your sign to just go for it, and go and answer some of those questions for us. And Freya, I really wanted to ask you, it's slightly different to what we've been talking about, but kind of related as well, as to how sharks can adapt to some of these threats. And something that you've been working on is about how whale sharks can recover from injury, and it is absolutely fascinating. So I wanted to ask you about this paper that you published last year.
Yeah. So as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm really interested in this threat quantification, particularly with whale sharks. And one way that we can start to approach this is by monitoring whale shark injuries or scarring, and specifically looking at sort of how many individuals have scars at aggregation sites and how many of these scars are linked to interactions with humans. And these scars have been a really useful monitoring method, really, because they can provide us with evidence of interactions that sharks may have been involved in or events that sharks may have been involved in. And as a result, they can really identify the threats that they're also exposed to. So my master's thesis sort of compared the frequency of injured sharks across 4 aggregation sites in the Indian Ocean, and a large proportion of those injuries were linked to vessel collisions, specifically small vessel collisions. So these are these sort of outboard motors with fairly small propellers, and especially in places like the Maldives. where they have quite a lot of tourism activity there. And as a result of this sort of work, there's a real strong push to kind of improve on regulations in these areas and try and develop some stricter enforcement codes around where these whale sharks are aggregating. And we're all just thinking, well, wow, we've got this amazing opportunity where we're encountering sharks quite regularly because of ecotourism. So this was a lot of citizen science involved here as well. So we're able to see, sharks over the course of, weeks to months quite regularly, and we're able to therefore track these injuries. And because whale sharks have this unique identification as well, we're able to ID that individual and then see, okay, well, how is that particular wound changing over time? So it's really a great combination of sort of fortuitous circumstances that have allowed us to get a study of this kind. So we sort of looked deeper into these injury characteristics. What are they like? How can we determine the source of them? And we tried to develop a way of standardizing their monitoring. So we looked at classification methods for severity, size, that sort of thing. And then we quantified the rate of healing. So we were able to use these images of wounds over time to come up with a way of quantifying change over time. And we found just that they had these remarkable healing capabilities. So we were encountering these sharks with huge open wounds that were often caused by propeller strikes. And there's one particular shark that comes to mind called Nakoko, who had a wound that actually 3 separate wounds in a course of 3 years, all related to propeller strikes. And these were huge lacerations, all of which healed within a couple of months. And now, thankfully, he's completely healed, swimming as normal, and moving about quite happily. And it's just a remarkable observation. So what it really tells us is that they're capable of not only sort of responding to some of the threats that we may be presenting them, but perhaps adapting as well in future to some of these more extreme environments. But there is, in today's science world, this could be seen as quite a positive outcome for research, because it really does show, okay, we have a very resilient animal here that's capable of responding to some of the threats. But we do have some, concerns here, because we found that lacerations, which are the types of wounds that result from anthropogenic sources, things like propellers, which are distinct from abrasions, which are sort of these surface layer epidermal wounds, which tend to result from courtship or perhaps more natural behaviours. These lacerations take about twice as long to heal. So although they can heal, some of these more serious wounds, these deep lacerations, if they're exposed to these through human activities, essentially it means we're exposing them to prolonged healing times. And we still don't know the sort of sublethal impacts of these healing times and these injuries. So, they can be mechanical. Are they suffering from internal damage? Does it mean that they're assigning more energy towards healing that takes that energy allocation away from growth, reproduction, all of those sort of essential aspects of their aerobic metabolic scope, that kind of stuff? Perhaps their behaviours may be altered. With a debilitating wound, does it mean that they're less capable of moving to new foraging areas, and therefore they remain in the area that they actually originally got the injury, which we think might happen with Nakoko, because they're less capable of moving about with these huge wounds? And that sort of thing is very difficult to monitor. So we think that, yes, it's great that they can heal, and it's really quite an amazing example of this kind of outcome in shark science and the wider field, but we really need to prevent some of these really quite serious injuries from occurring, and that's through things like encounter codes, stricter enforcement of rules in these whale shark habitats around tourism sites, that sort of thing, slower boats, minimum distances between boats and sharks. That's really important if they are to sort of cope with these increased stresses.
That's a really important message as well, because I think a lot of people, like you said, Freya, they pin a fair bit of hope on the fact that sharks are going to be able to adapt to these extreme changes, but just because they can adapt doesn't mean that doesn't affect them in some way, or that they should have to as well. I hope that sometime in the future they don't have to adapt to these stresses that we're talking about. And you were also kind of talking about sort of my next question, which is, how we can use this data for good. How can we use this data to change things like fisheries management and policy, but also, tourism practices as well, like you've just talked about. So David, I'll come to you. So how can you use your the data from the Global Shark Movement Project? How can data like that be used to inform policy and management strategies?
Yeah, good question. I mean, to me, and I'm biased in this, of course, it should really be part of the central set of data that fishery managers are looking at. I mentioned it right at the start of our conversation. You can't manage something if you don't know where it is. And okay, you might be able to, log the catches that are made by the fishing fleet, but that's not necessarily where all the sharks are. That gives you fishery dependent maps of where you're finding them, relative abundance and so on. But with the satellite tracking data, if we can track enough of these sharks over long enough time periods, we'll be able to map their hotspots of space use. And that is a fishery independent way of looking at important areas for sharks and rays. And I think that's where the Global Shark Movement and other sorts of projects like it can come into play, making available this global scale, ocean basin scale data of where sharks prefer to be, and then to analyze the overlaps. And in fact, this is something that the International Union for the Conservation of Nature is already thinking about, of bringing into red list assessments the whole idea of what are the important areas for sharks and rays. Obviously, for other red list assessed species, especially terrestrial ones, this is already done. But for sharks and rays, the data hasn't been there to do that. But because of the tracking technology, we have another great source of data, a fishery independent source of data that we can use to identify those important areas. And so linked to that is obviously what I was talking about with climate change, the ocean deoxygenation, climate driven changes in where the sharks are. And obviously that alters the rates at which they are exploited, as I mentioned. They're easier to catch, it seems, or the catches are higher in areas where they have vertical habitat compression, such as the oxygen minimum zone. So we've really got to get used to the idea that management measures have got to mitigate, in being put into place, they've got to mitigate the effects of climate change. And at the moment, that isn't the case for pelagic sharks.
Goodness, I could talk to you both all day and pick your brains all day. There's endless possibilities of the avenues that we can go down, but I've kept you for long enough. But I'm sure our listeners will have loved hearing about all of that, and the public and citizens as well. The work is so incredibly fascinating. But I do have one final question. It is a very, very quick one, and it's a bit of a silly one, but it's one of our favorites, which is, if you could be any species of shark and ray in the world, what would you be and why? So Freya, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, that's quite a tough question to answer, I think. But I think, given my sort of inherent wanderlust, I'd probably have to be one of these wide-ranging kind of oceanic nomads that gets to swim amongst the world ocean. So I'm kind of drawn towards the blue shark for that reason, because they are one of the most wide-ranging sharks, and they're really beautiful, and they've got loads of awesome adaptations that David's spoken about. But the one thing that draws me away from that is the fact that it would probably be too cold. They like to live in these quite chilly environments compared to my preferences. So with that in mind, I think I probably have to say the whale shark, which I didn't want to because I do too much about whale sharks, but I can't deny the fact that I just love them. So, cruising around these warm tropical waters, all I have to do to feed is just open my mouth. Very relaxed lifestyle. And added bonus, if I was one, I'd have a sort of more of an understanding about where they're going and what they're doing, which means my PhD would be a lot easier. So I'd probably have to say whale shark.
Oh, that's an amazing answer. Everyone loves a whale shark.
Cliché,
I don't think there's anything wrong with saying whale shark at all. And they do have a very nice existence. And I love the idea that you picked your answer based on what would advance your science more. And David, how about you?
Yeah, Freya stole my reasoning there, because I was thinking that it'd be great to be a shark that would get into regions that we know very little about.
Yeah.
And so for that reason, I think I try and be one of these deep diving sharks, a short fin mako, a blue shark, or perhaps a deep diving ray. I know that some of those devil rays go really deep that they've tracked from the Azores. And I just love to explore and to see what's down there in these depths. But also, spend time lounging around in these tropical waters. So, makos and blues, let's say a mako can swim sort of slow if it wants to enjoy the warmth, then it can dive deep on an exploration. But then also it can it can swim super fast as well. And I really like that sort of speed element. I don't have a sports car, but it would be great if I did, for me anyway. I don't know about any other road user. It would just be fun to have those different aspects. And so I reckon I'd like to be a short fin mako for a while before I then had a go at being a basking shark. I'd like that as well. But then I'd like to be a cat shark as well, a small spotted cat shark, tooling around on the reef. I think that would be really good as well.
Get the best of all worlds. I think your basking shark and the cat shark maybe would be nice retirement options. So when you finish your life as a short fin mako and you've retired, you can have quite a nice relaxing life as a basking shark, just swimming around with your mouth open.
I like that. That's a plan. That's a plan.
Yeah, they're both brilliant answers, and you've been so generous with your time and given me such amazing detailed answers, and it's been so fascinating to get to know both of you and your work, and I wish you all the best of luck with your PhD and with the Global Shark Movement project moving forwards. But yes, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, that's great. And I'd just like to shout out, sorry Freya, I'd just like to shout out to the Save Our Seas Foundation, because I was probably one of the first grantees, or one of a small group when the foundation first started. They supported our work on blue sharks and mako sharks, and we wouldn't have been able to talk about this work actually without the pump priming funding that the Save Our Seas Foundation provided us. So really, it's gone full circle actually, and I'm really happy for that.
Yeah. Oh, amazing. Oh, that's a really nice note to end it on. Awesome. No, thank you both so much. The Whole Tooth is a podcast brought to you by the Save Our Seas Foundation. It is produced and edited by me, Isla Hodgson. Our beautiful artwork is by Nicola Poulos, and the wonderful jingle you can hear right now is by David Knight. If you like this episode, be sure to rate, review and subscribe. This means so much to us and helps us spread the word about how awesome sharks are. And if you would like one of your questions answered on the pod, or just want to say hi, please feel free to email us on isla@saveourseas.com. A huge thank you to David and Freya for their time, their knowledge and brilliant work, and to you at home for listening. Have a jawsome week, and we'll see you next time.